This is the all-new TFO Blitz, and it's the best fly rod TFO has ever made. The Blitz takes the place of the Axiom in the TFO lineup, and it's their fast action, mid-level stiffness rod. And while that seems a little bit confusing to me, it's definitely not an ultra fast rod that you might expect with a name like the Blitz. And the thinking there is that if you get excited by seeing fish like albies or striped bass erupting all over, you're gonna be able to load the rod a little bit easier and actually make that cast. Whereas with a super fast rod, you might just be whiffing in the air. And I actually think that's fairly sound reasoning because it's happened to me and it's probably happened to all the rest of us as well. But this is also a fairly unique rod in a lot of other ways that we'll get to in the casting section. But before I do, let me walk you through some of the features which are also really interesting on the all-new Blitz. Starting from the bottom, you'll notice that this rod has a composite fighting butt. I'm not entirely sure why they did that. Perhaps there's some cost savings, perhaps it adds to durability, but it's a fighting butt, it does fighting butt things. And that moves into this anodized double up locking reel seat, which is fine. It also does reel seat things. One thing I did like about this is that they included two hook keepers, one on each side, so you can tuck that fly up into that reel seat, which is sort of a really nice benefit that I feel like a lot of saltwater rods miss. Then we've got a pretty standard full Wells grip. It's nice, it's just about the right size. It's in comparable quality cork that we've come to expect from TFO. And that's of course finished with a composite top piece, and that I do think adds somewhat to the durability of the cork. Then we've got this cool teal greenish blank. I think it's nice. It's definitely a rod that stands out, but doesn't stand out too much. So it doesn't have a giant white label or anything like that. And then as we move up, TFO has included alignment dots, which we like. And it does have these cool blue wraps, which I think are a nice touch. And again, differentiate the rod a little bit from some of the competitors. Then we get into some really interesting features, which are REC recoil guides on a mid-priced rod. As far as I'm aware, this TFO Blitz is the lowest priced rod to include these high performance guides. Really great feature for a saltwater rod. And then, as you'll see on most rods, we've got stainless steel snake guides going up the rest of the way. But of course, you're all waiting to see how this rod performs, so let's get it outside in our test casting field and see how it does. This video is supported 100% by your purchases at Trident Fly Fishing. So if you're in the market for some new tackle, check us out at tridentflyfishing.com. Starting at our first saltwater distance of 40 feet, you notice a couple of things right away. One, even though we're casting an SA bonefish line, this rod is not an ultra fast rod. You actually have some feel at the close distance and a reasonable amount of accuracy. The other thing you notice is that this is actually a fairly light rod. And if I'm not mistaken, it's the lightest by swing weight TFO 8-weight ever. However, I will caveat that by saying TFO publishes an actual weight of 3.95 ounces on their website, and the physical weight of this rod that we have in our hands is actually about 4.5. But if you've watched our videos before, you know that swing weight actually makes a lot more difference than pure physical weight, so I'm not that upset about it. As I said, 40 feet, you've got a nice lightweight rod, it makes an accurate cast. You could definitely do some weighting for bonefish with this 8-weight Blitz. But being called the Blitz, that's not really what this rod's designed for, so as we move back to 60 feet, you start to get a better feel for the character of this rod. And while we're fishing with our standard SA bonefish line, if you're fishing a true Blitz, say here in the Northeast, you're probably going to be using something else, but we'll cover that later. In terms of overall feel and power, this rod is able to deliver a fly easily to that 60-foot distance. Unfortunately, accuracy suffers a bit at the middle distance. We've seen that with several rods in the past, but I feel like with the Blitz, it was a little bit more pronounced. But I also think that's fine if you're going to call a rod the Blitz. Let's face it, at the end of the day, if you're fishing for striped bass, you don't generally need to hit a plate-sized target if you're in the middle of a blitz. On the other hand, if you want it to do some double duty for bonefish, I think there are probably some better rods that are going to be more accurate at that 60-foot distance. Then move it back to 80 feet. Story's pretty similar. I actually think the rod tightens up a little bit at the longer distance. Not only can you make these long casts, but they are a little bit more accurate, relatively speaking, than the 60-foot distance. It's also just a really pleasing rod to cast, even at longer distances. It's got great flex, the right amount of feel. It doesn't feel over or underloaded. And honestly, SA Bonefish feels like sort of a pretty good line pairing for the Blitz, which is interesting and definitely something that we should talk about next, which is line choices. When we recommend a line for striped bass or false albacore or any of these blitzing type species, we tend to recommend short, very weight forward lines, like a Rio outbound short, an SA Titan taper. But if you were to put one of those lines on this Blitz, you would find it severely, severely overloaded, especially with an outbound short. And that is a really interesting finding for a rod that is called the Blitz. But if you take that line down to something that's a little bit more balanced, like a Rio striper, for instance, the rod casts beautifully. And in fact, if you're buying a TFO Blitz and using it for striped bass, you should really strongly consider that Rio striper line, because it is the magic taper for this rod. And we've cast it not only on this 8-weight, but on the 9-weight as well, and it's really fantastic. But just to keep things interesting, I also cast a 7-weight Titan taper on the 8-weight Blitz, and that cast fairly well. And while I think this rod is an absolutely fantastic package, it does beg the question, is it really an 8-weight? I suspect if you're a follower of the true to line weight lines, you will say yes, this is a true to line weight 8-weight, and it does exactly what it should. However, if you've fished most of the saltwater rods in the last 5 to 10 years, I think you'll find that this rod is a lot softer and either pickier or not quite powerful enough to be considered a saltwater 8-weight by today's standards. But I'll leave that up to you. If you're looking for a mid-priced rod that casts really spectacularly well, and is combined with lightweight for those days when you're going to be blind casting all day long, this rod offers everything that you'll find in a top-end rod, with the exception of maybe that little bit of extra power at half the price. And now it's time for our Poseidon Score. Up first is accuracy, and while I think the Blitz is a sufficiently accurate rod for most applications, I probably wouldn't make this my #1 permit or bonefish rod. It just doesn't have that middle distance accuracy that I think is really useful for those applications. But I also think it's okay. This is a rod that's designed for blitzing fish, where if you get it within 3 feet, you're doing great. That said, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Up next are components, and while this is a pretty standard TFO from a lot of respects, the components have actually received a little bit of an upgrade here. I like the reel seat. I really like the recoil guides. I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10. Up next is distance and power, and this rod is a little bit of a conundrum. If you put a line that's light, like a bonefish line, it's fine. If you use the line that I really like on it, which is that Rio striper line, it's fantastic. You can really easily access the entire fly line. On the other hand, if you put a Titan on it, which is maybe a test of the true power of the rod, it sort of falls apart. All in all, I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10. I just don't know exactly how powerful of a rod this really is, but it's going to be good enough for those blitzing applications for sure. Next is going to be the grip, and it's got a pretty standard grip, albeit with some composite cork parts, but I also feel like that's fine and definitely more than fine for this price point, and it earns a 7 out of 10. In terms of looks and workmanship, this rod is going to be a pretty standard overseas build, and that means it is fine. But if you're looking for those finer details like you'd find on a Winston or a TNT, they're just not going to be there. Frankly, if you get your glasses out and really taking a look at these wraps, you're going to find some that are not that great. Overall, I give it a 6 out of 10 for workmanship. Next is the swing weight, and this comes in at a very, very light 72 gram meters squared, which earns it a 9.5 out of 10. I will caveat that, I think, a little bit by the fact that this is a rod that maybe is only a borderline 8 weight, and for a 7 weight, 72 is not spectacular, but the designers have put an 8 on the rod, and therefore it earns a 9.5. In terms of value, I think the TFO Blitz offers a really great package. You get a rod that casts really well, and especially well with the right line, that's got an extremely light swing weight, and it does it all with some upgraded components for a price of $430. And while that's by no means cheap, in today's ever-increasing price of fly rod world, it's definitely on the lower end of things. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 for value. And last but not least, we get to the cool factor. And while I definitely think that TFO is probably cooler among a certain crowd than some other rods, it's definitely not a rod that's going to get oohs and ahs from all of your friends. I'd say 7.5 out of 10. And that brings us to a total Poseidon score of 61, which, if I'm not mistaken, is, drumroll, the highest score we've ever given a TFO. Of course, you're not going to see those truly awesome, super high-end scores on a rod like this because it's just not going to compete on some of those categories like looks and componentry with the Winstons and Scotts of the world. But for a rod at this price, it's truly, truly fantastic. Tell us what you think about the Blitz by leaving us a comment in the box below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We've got a lot of great rod reviews with all of the 2024 models coming right up. And don't forget, if you've got questions about this rod, give us a shout at 888-413-5211 or email us 24/7 at support@tridentflyfishing.com. I'm Ben. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.